thinking about, can you hear me? Yeah, I feel like the audio should be a bit higher.
Like in thinking about your body of work, both fiction and non-fiction, mostly the thing that I see in your work is that you're writing about people who are striving for something greater than themselves. Sometimes deeply flawed people, sometimes dysfunctional people. What was your job in this book? What are you trying to achieve with this novel?
Oh, thank you. So, when I start writing, I never actually think about what it is that I don't have an objective in mind. I just sort of, usually it comes in the form of a scene or a character doing something, and that usually gets the process rolling. So I never have any kind of, any idea of what it is that I want to say, what the themes are, what the overall kind of point of the piece is. That's something that usually sort of reveals itself later on. But what I was fascinated by, and the reason why I started this book, and I started actually a long time ago, back in 2013, there was a spate of cases in Toronto where I lived at the time, where you had a bunch of young Somali men who were basically going to Somalia in order to fight for Al-Shabaab. And there were, so the Canadian version of the FBI estimated that something like 25 young Somali men, most of them who were born in Canada, who were fully Canadian, have somehow made the decision that they would rather leave their, the life that they know in order to fight for this cause. And I remember as I read a lot of these news reports, and as we all know in journalism, a lot of times the news reports are pretty, they don't really give you a lot of the answers that you long for. It's like, so-and-so who's 17 or 18 is alleged to have, gone to fight for Al-Shabaab. And you're left with more questions than answers. So the novel really came out of that yearning to have answers, like what would possess a young Somali guy who is as Canadian as the next guy to do this to take this life-altering decision, this incredible act of, I don't even know what to call it really. And so that's where the novel was born out of, a need to find answers. And since there were no answers to be found, I guess I sort of created my own version of answers, my fictitious answers.
Yeah. Because you also left Somalia as a 13-year-old and went to Canada.
How do you reconcile that? How did you reconcile your story with the people you were trying to write about, even though it wasn't a fictional poem?
Wow, that was loud. Sorry about that. So this is something that a lot of times people who haven't immigrated to, the West, as we like to call it, this sort of almost, magical land we call the West. A lot of times what people don't understand, especially in the context of Somalis and Somali immigrants, is that oftentimes the people who have gone before the war, as was the case with my family, and there were quite a few, thousands of Somalis who left before the war and settled in London, mostly around DC area, and Toronto being one of the places they settled. You can almost tell, like you can almost separate those people from the people who came in terms of, as a result of like refugee, what's that program called, where the resettlement programs. And because there's a lot of the young people who were born in the West, again, I'll keep saying this, the same way that they say Africa is this like general place, I'm just going to say the West. A lot of times you can tell the difference in terms of their psychological kind of makeup, their emotional makeup, their something is different. And I think the more that I thought about it, the one thing that I can think of is that we were lucky enough to have escaped the trauma of the war. And so we had a completely different life in terms of, finishing school and getting good jobs and properly assimilating into the society in which we were a part of. And then what ended up happening with like later sort of arrivals is that they found it really difficult to be a part of this society that they're being told you're one of them, but they can't help but feel different. They're oftentimes made to feel different, even within the community. So there's this shift that happens sometime between like early 90s to like, I would say mid 90s, even late 90s, where you could definitely see a sort of a different trajectory for people who came before and people who came after the war. And so when I was writing this novel and thinking about these characters, there was nothing about Noor, the protagonist, that I could really relate to in that sense. I, in fact, related a lot more to his teacher, who came about the same age as I did, who came to Canada before the war, whose life in many ways mirrored my own life. So even though the natural sort of inclination is to think that I identify more with Noor, it's actually the other way around. So for me, I couldn't really honestly say that I found it easy to identify with his plight, for lack of a better word, because our lives were just so different. Our experiences as new Canadians were so different. The way that we have come to think of ourselves and our identity was so different.
I want to dig into that point a little bit and push back. And I'm thinking, you're listening to you right now, I'm thinking about Amos Oz, the Israeli writer who said, without a wound, there's no author.
Without a what?
Without a wound,
Yeah.
there's no author.
Oh.
Where I read parts of this book and I thought you really identified with the challenges that faced the Somalis who were either had moved to Toronto at the time, just as you did, or maybe came after you, and also with the way the teacher in the story, Mr. Elmi, thinks about Mogadishu. I think those were very vivid and sort of like had almost a childhood imagination in that. Like, where does that come from?
Without a wound, there's no author. I love that. Now I feel like I should go to a shrink and find out what this wound is that I've been carrying around with me.
Well, it comes out in your sentences.
Yeah. You make a really good point, which is that yes, as you can imagine, so I don't know how many people know this, but when my family decided that we're moving to Canada, I was, I think, 12, about to turn 13, or 13, about to turn 14, I can't remember exactly. But, you're a young man, you're trying to figure out who you are, and then you move to this country where you don't speak the language. I mean, I like, literally the extent of my English was like, yes, no. And then to find yourself in this foreign land, foreign culture, foreign everything, and then try to sort of put yourself back together in terms of some kind of a cohesive identity that makes sense to you, that feels authentic to you, that was a challenge. And I don't think it's a challenge that my older brothers dealt with, because they were already fully formed, for lack of a better term, because they were much older than me. And so I found myself in this tricky space of sort of just coming into myself as a young adult, but not having all the familiarities of culture, of extended family, of relatives and all that. So if there is any wound, that would probably be the source of the wound. Just sort of this sense of confusion and of trying to form a sense of identity that feels authentic to you, that feels real to you. And I think I probably would share that with the young protagonist. As for the teacher, I think that actually feels a lot more real to me, that for people who haven't read the book, the protagonist develops a really strong bond with his biology teacher, who also happens to be a Somali immigrant, who left Somalia a bit older and has a vivid memory of Mogadishu and what it used to be. And that's something that I also share. And so when I talk about how he feels about his childhood in Mogadishu, it's in a sense actually my own childhood that I'm talking about.
When I want us to talk a little bit about privilege, because this is also a book about not just about assimilation, but also a book about a second act, right? How did that play for you in your childhood, moving to Canada, and also how does that play for the young Somalis who are in Canada now, when there's a lot of conversation around access and just being able to assimilate and integrate into these societies. As late as yesterday, I was reading news of a Canadian official in Ottawa saying that black people and immigrants are deliberately bypassed for jobs and promotions.
No, absolutely. That's one of the biggest challenges facing not just Somali immigrant community, but also all immigrant communities in Canada is that people who are incredibly smart and qualified and dynamic never end up sort of getting that foot in the door of, whether it's their careers or just basically being a part of the society that you're at infinitum told this is your home now. But then because I remember being a radio journalist at CBC Radio, and I think I might have been like one of like 5 black people in that building, and that's when it really hits you how segregated the society is in terms of access to jobs and opportunities, and so that's something that plays a huge role in the level of privilege that the characters in this novel enjoy or don't enjoy more accurately. And what that privilege, because this is a word we keep hearing a lot about these days, is privilege, especially white privilege. And a lot of people don't really understand what that means, and they get defensive, and it's almost like when you say that to a white person, it's like almost, a lot of, I'm going to like actually generalize, but some people have said that they interpret it as though you're taking away something from their accomplishments or what they've been able to do with their lives, and that's just not the point at all, as I understand. The idea that some people have privilege and other people don't is that the great thing about privilege is that you're able to actually make mistakes, do something like some really idiotic things with your life, and somehow, because there is this large net of class and privilege that's able to catch you when those things happen, and then you can get on with your life and find who you are. And I mean, look at George Bush, for crying out loud. Sorry, I had to say that. I couldn't resist. So there is a lot of people, and you don't have to be at the upper echelon of of society, of wealth to that level. You could just be like a regular middle class white Canadian American or Brit, and you still have some sort of net that catches you when you make mistakes. And unfortunately, what ends up happening a lot with immigrant communities, especially black immigrant communities, and I will speak for Canada because I haven't lived in other places long enough to make these kinds of judgments, is that net doesn't exist. You're basically constantly sort of walking this tightrope of, you have your ambitions, you have your dreams, but then all it takes is one wrong move to basically forever alter your trajectory of your life in a way that can feel and is oftentimes insurmountable.
Did you feel like you had that growing up, or did you even have like a Mr. Almi who held your hand?
I had a Mr. Almi. She happened to be a white lady, actually, who was one of my favorite teachers. I remember she taught English, and I remember writing an essay. It was 10th year English class, and I remember writing an essay. And she just had this incredible, she wrote this note at the bottom saying like, this is one of the best essays I read, and you showed really great promise, but you need to work on this. And you can like really do this. And to just have somebody that you looked up to express that kind of, to express that faith in you can make just the difference between, a world of difference. And that's a role that Mr. Almi provides for Noor, our protagonist, and that's the role that my teacher provided for me.
I want to shift the conversation. We're going to open up to the public soon, but I want to shift the conversation a little bit and ask you about, and again, like I'm looking not just at this book, but like also your first novel and your narrative nonfiction. You're mostly writing about men.
Mm-hmm.
You're mostly writing about African men. You're mostly writing about African men in the diaspora. Mm-hmm. And in many of these cases, they are people who are just grappling with a lot of things in life, right? Why is that? Why do you write about men? And Mrs. Harris, why are you not?
Yeah. Actually, that's a really interesting question, because I remember when I started taking these writing classes, in first year of university, and there were like fiction classes. And for like the first 3 years of taking these various classes, I almost exclusively wrote about women. And then, I don't know, something happened, some switch. And I remember actually talking to a friend about this. And I think one of the reasons could be that I find, in some ways, men are a mystery to me because they have such a sort of, we don't have the kind of deep friendships that a lot of times women have, and we don't express our feelings and our fears and our, just all the things that we fear in life. So, we might have like guy buddies that we go out and like watch sports with or something. But so I find that sense of closeness and closed off fascinating. And it's like the same way that I was saying to you that, the book was born out of questions. I think a lot of times I write about men, and oftentimes men of the same kind of ilk, in order to understand, like, who are these creatures? Like, what the hell's wrong with them kind of thing? So, in this sense, it's out of deep fascination with particular types of men that I either have within my own extended family or within my circle of friends.
And where do you think the story of women is placed within these male characters?
Yeah. Well, as you have read in my first novel, of course, the primary focus might have been on the male protagonists, but they always were in relation to how they thought of themselves as men in relation to the women in their lives. So whether it was Andrew and his wife, or Somali, the only sole Somali character in that book, in relation to his wife and the tragedy that they had, losing their child. And so the men in my novels are never just sort of like these solitary figures. They define themselves largely in relation to the women in their lives and how those women see them, and how, whether or not those women, in this novel, as I'm sure you've picked up on, Mr. Elmi, it longs to know what his wife thinks of him. Like, does she think I'm a good man? Does she respect me? Does she love me? So there's this lack that is inherent in them, and they're trying to sort of fill that void through how they figure in their lives in relation to the women in their lives. So in a sense, the women are actually far more integral to who they are than you would think just reading sort of on the surface.
One of the key characters in this novel is an imam.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about religion and how you think about that, especially when you compare to 13 years of living in Mogadishu and Somalia's conflagration, and what religion has now become in the country, mm-hmm. and then the type of religion that you also, I don't want to say experience, but practice mm-hmm. in Canada. How did you compare and contrast these different type of ideologies, or did you at all?
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't ask easy questions, does he? That's a really great question, and I think if there's anything that I consciously wanted to explore, because like I said, I'm never really conscious about what the book explores until much later. But one of the things that I did want to explore on a conscious level was what has happened to our perception of ourselves as Muslims just within my own lifetime, growing up in Mogadishu at a very young age and seeing the kind of Islam that I saw, which was a lot more sort of plural and a lot more democratic and a lot more kind of open. And then going to Canada and then experiencing even more of that, people who really who seemed to have a really much more personal relationship with God and what it meant to be Islam, and they had a lot more sort of a lot more room to define for themselves what that meant. And then ever since the Civil War, and then of course what has happened after the Civil War and the coming of the kind of a sort of more puritanical, more sort of Wahhabi style kind of Islam into our lives, and seeing the impact that has had on not only on our own families, but at the community level, but also at the national level. has been really quite interesting. And one of the things that I think I find grappling with is the kind of conformity that I find oftentimes within our own sort of Somali Muslims. There is a conformity of thought and of a way of seeing the world and a way of making sense of the world that I find, I think, is detrimental to our community. I think there's the kind of freedom that we experience in terms of really defining for ourselves what it meant to be Muslim Somali seem to be sort of decreasing. That space seems to be getting smaller and smaller. And I'm curious and interested and also slightly worried about what that means going forward for our country. So am I going to get so much hate tweet about this, Abdi?
No, I wanna dig into that a little bit and just be like, so you're writing about a young boy tussling with religion and having the Imam's character in there, and your book, for better for, is going to be distributed, right, like in the West and in countries where, society is meant to be deeply Islamophobic.
Mm-hmm.
How do you write about religion? Is there a point in your writing when you're like, I'm going to censor myself because there's certain things that I probably shouldn't put it out there, maybe shouldn't expose or
If I were wise, I probably would do that. It's probably easier to do that. But again, I like I said, I genuinely half the time don't know. I don't have any kind of conscious sort of thought about what is appropriate, what might be controversial, what might be sort of what might get people to disagree, which I welcome disagreement. I think that's how we grow, that having our assumptions challenged, our beliefs challenged is nothing but a great thing. So in writing the book and also in having one of the central characters be this, very puritanical imam, was in some ways a way of me sort of having a dialogue, both with somebody who is like Mr. Elmi and somebody who's like Imam, who's like the Imam, and having this kind of almost like an internal dialogue that just happens to take the form of novel. Yes, thank you. I'm having a little moment of like, what was the Imam's name again? So yeah, I don't want to say that I was actually really conscious about how people would interpret it, or for people who haven't written novels, writing a novel is a supremely selfish act, because for years and years you're locked up in your room and you can't afford to think about whether or not that book is going to get published, whether if we get published, is it going to be read? You just don't have the luxury of even thinking that far ahead. Because sometimes you're going from scene to scene to moment, so the idea that I would somehow try to calibrate my expression or my thoughts is just, I think that would just be like a bad idea.
My last question to you, and then open to the public. I read your book in the context of thinking about, Nuruddin Farah, Nadif Muhammad, Christina Ali Farah, Dirio Osman, and all these Somali writers, whether living in Africa or in the diaspora, write, their characters are based on Somalia's civil war. It's like it's either based in Somalia or like stems from what happened after the war, right?
Talk about a wound. I mean,
precisely, right? It's easy to start a war, but it's hard to create a story that keeps people from warring themselves. So now that we are in this age when people are talking about Mogadishu rising, Somalia rising, Somalia's coming back, we have federal government, things along those lines. How do you think, and I want you to talk about, forget non-fiction, how do you think non-fiction could help redefine or reimagine the story of Somalia?
I think one of the great things that fiction does is that it gives you that room to imagine the lives of others and to make sense of the world through characters who are different from you, who have different experiences than you. I think it's an incredible sort of form that is so malleable and so sort of open and capacious in that sense that it gives you a lot of freedom. And I think it's one of the great things about the novel is that unlike, let's say, theater, which I love live theater, but it sort of happens in a room, and if you're not there, you miss it kind of thing, where a novel, you can take it with you to, like, you could be going to Tahiti and you can take it with you and experience somebody's life that's so different from you and in such a faraway context, culturally, politically, geographically. And so I think one of the great things about having all these Somali diaspora writers, whether it's Nadif Muhammad or Nuruddin Farah and all these people that you mentioned, is that we are allowed to, from far away from our home, this place that has such an impact on forming us, and of course the war, which is a lot of Somali new diaspora writing deals with this national trauma that we've all had, the Great Wound. Can I coin that phrase from now? The Great Wound. In some ways, we're all, I don't know how many people are you familiar with the British Somali novelist Nadif Muhammad's writing, but a lot of her fiction is so concerned with what happened to Somalia. How did we basically sort of destroy ourselves in that war? And I think it's this trauma that a lot of Somali writers carry with them is like trying to make sense of what happened, where did we go wrong, how do we come back from that, and it's hopefully a kind of national, international conversation that we could all be having in the form of whether it's fiction or non-fiction, just to have that space of wondering aloud, asking ourselves what happened. And I think when you think about, not to romanticize war and civil war, but I think if you think about all the countries that have really become the countries that they are now, whether it's the US or Britain or a lot of these places, they had these huge traumatic, Germany, Rwanda, I'm just going to keep throwing that. They all had these incredibly traumatic national experiences that really tore the country apart, tore the people apart. And then through the decades, through the years, through conversations with writers and journalists and artists, hopefully there's a dialogue that takes place where, far away from the anguish of that moment, of the killing and violence, we can all try to make sense of, reconstruct an identity and a sense of nationhood that makes sense, that is inclusive, that allows for everybody who experienced that trauma to bring their own perspectives. And one of the things I would love to see more of is, because I don't know how, we have some non-Somalis here, but for all Somalis who know this, the people who get to tell the story of the Civil War and what happened is oftentimes the very few privileged people who were already the elites of society before the war started. They just sort of continue that role. And what I'd love to see more of is the poor people, the people from the south, the people from the farmlands of Somalia, who were never given that opportunity to tell from their perspective how the war impacted them, how it changed their lives, how it changed their communities. And if you look at right now what's happening in Somalia, the people who are the most affected by Al-Shabaab and its crimes, the people mostly are the people in the rural parts of southern Somalia who are really dealing with the brunt of whether it's the drought or the violence or the terrorism. So in terms of that question you asked of like how do we reconstruct or construct a Somali identity moving forward, I would love to see one that's a lot more inclusive of these previously marginalized communities, more women, more basically more LGBTQ voices, basically really like broaden out that tent so that we get to hear a lot more of the Somali voices rather than the few people that we both know. Yeah.
I'm going to open the space now and questions.
Hi, congratulations on the book.
Thank you, man.
I just had a question.
Sorry, what's your name again?
Omar Ma.
Omar.
you've written this novel, and I imagine most of your writing is in English, in a language that up until you were 13 years old you couldn't speak, as you just pointed out just now. How does that affect the way you view the stories, and how does that affect the way you shape the narrative that you tell? Thank you.
I'm really bad at remembering, so can I just answer quickly and then move on to the next one?
Okay.
Yeah. That's a great question. I'll make it really fast so that we can get as many questions as possible. So Somalis know, and I think a lot of other people also know, that Somali language is incredibly poetic, incredibly lyrical. We have incredible history of, poetry and folklore, and what happens when you haven't been fluent in that language and you become fluent in English is that a lot of that kind of lyrical, poetical sort of language gets lost, and you sort of start writing in this kind of very cerebral, business-like kind of language that English is oftentimes. And I think if there is a concrete kind of effect that had, the fact that I didn't write in Somali and couldn't even write it even if I tried, is that it was probably far less sort of poetic and far less using metaphor and all these rich techniques that Somali language uses that I'm lacking, because that's just not how I've sort of trained my brain to write. And so it doesn't impact so much the story you tell, but how you tell it. And I would love to, at some point, become fluent enough in Somali that I can write the kind of stories that I grew up with, the kind of beautiful songs and poetry that I grew up with. For me, that would be an incredible privilege.
Okay. As we pass the mic around, please, let me ask you to please introduce.
My name is Lafton. He knows me already.
Hi, Lafton.
But how did you come up with the title, and does it play any transcendental role, as in the youth of God?
Okay, so actually, if you look at what Al-Shabaab means, it's basically, it's almost like a direct translation of them seeing themselves as the youth of God. They're almost like God's representatives on this earth, kind of thing. Am I correct in like sort of my interpretation of what that means?
Shabbat means youth.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's where the title comes from. And there's a scene in the novel when, for the first time, when our protagonist Noor comes across that phrase, and it has a very kind of discombobulating effect on him. He's like incredibly sort of excited by the notion of being a youth of God, but also at the same time being incredibly finding it very presumptuous notion, and also being very scared of the idea of what it means to be a youth of God on this earth. Yeah. Oh yes, and so if you look at also the book cover, you will notice that it's the kind of stark black and white kind of imagery is also quite reminiscent and sort of purposefully paying. I don't want to say the word homage, not that. No. It's referencing. Let's put it that way. Yes, it's referencing the Al-Shabaab flag. If you've seen it, you know what it looks like. So there's a lot of that kind of play on what Al-Shabaab sees itself as, how it sort of builds itself, and so yeah, that's where it came from.
Hi, my name is Najala. He knows where I'm from. My question is, do you feel, as an African writer, do you feel a burden to tell the truth in your novels?
The truth? What is the truth?
Well, it's really, because you've talked about this concept of this great wound, and I think it's a really interesting one, because you see it in Nigerian writing with the Biafra War, how it haunts Nigerian writing. You see it in South Africa with the apartheid, and you see it sort of as a recurring theme in Somali literature. You've mentioned Nadifa and Nuruddin and other writers. So when you're thinking and putting all these things together, do you feel a burden to tell the truth? Or do you feel like, maybe let me just leave it there. Do you feel like there's a burden to tell the truth?
The only burden that I feel when I'm writing is to be as truthful as I can to the experiences of the characters. That's literally what I consider to be my job. And if that truth isn't sort of doesn't conform to the truths of other people, especially the reader, there's not really much I can do about that. I think to try to put yourself in a position of telling the truth, capital T, I think is incredibly dangerous for a fiction writer. So to answer your question, no, I don't see that. Yeah.
Hi Hassan, my name is Ahmed Bullet. I'm a Kenyan. Just a quick one. Just one question, two parts. The first one is, do you think writing about men often as Abdi Latif mentioned, often as a dialogue in African languages?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Sure. As Dave pointed out earlier, like you write about men often, right? So like, do you think it often like a dialogue within the African community, the African men, and specifically the Somali men? And if so, whose responsibility is it to push forward this narrative? For example, you're reading a novel for this concerning the Somali men. So like, after this, who do you to push the narrative forward?
Can you repeat the question for me, please?
So in writing about men,
Yeah.
African men, Somali men,
Yeah.
and if I correct me, I get this wrong. Do you see yourself in the shoes of like, are you trying to start a dialogue about, the dysfunctions, the flaws, that men might have in these books that you're writing?
If that were a byproduct of the work of people reading it and then having a conversation, much like we're having now, that would be like, of course, any writer's dream to spark conversation. But again, like I said, and I hate to sound like a broken record, that's just not something that you think about ahead of time while you're writing. Like I said to Nanjala, it's really like at the moment of writing, all you can think about is how do I make this as truthful as possible to the experiences of these particular characters, of these particular men. And in doing so, and if you hopefully do it well enough, then that automatically becomes relatable to other men, it becomes more universal. So if, African men, Somali men can read the book and find their truths within that universe, of that confined universe of the book, and can relate to it, then that is any writer's dream. So yeah, absolutely, I would hope that would happen.
I want to with Nanjala and Ahmed's points because there's something
There's definitely, yeah.
There's something talking there about truth, right? And is that different with nonfiction, with Maps of Exile when you're writing that?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I mean, when you're writing nonfiction, especially long-form nonfiction, basically you're obsessed with accuracy, you're obsessed with, to the best of your ability, transmitting the truth of this person that you're writing about, and being as scrupulous about that as humanly possible, with everything in small details as the dates that this person did such and such, what happened to them on what date, those little things to the bigger issue of being truthful to their experience, to their point of view, to their opinions that they express to you, and not taking any liberties with those words and what they... Because sometimes you can quote somebody, but then just by taking things a little bit out of context, you can vastly change the meaning of what they said, even though you might have quoted them verbatim. So there's a lot of that kind of obsession with, like, am I being truthful to this person and their experience in a way that you don't feel that sense of responsibility with fiction. Yeah. You feel responsibility to your characters and their own particular truths, but there's no grand truth, there's no one truth, because, you have that freedom.
Even though fiction is a lie used to tell the truth.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the great things I love about fiction, and I remember, falling in love, specifically with the novel form, in that, of course, when you read a book like, I don't know, The Artist of a Young, the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, or, Beloved, or any of these great masterpieces of literature, you you are given an insight and a sense of sort of a privileged kind of access to the consciousness and to the interior lives of people in a way that I don't think, like, journalism doesn't do that, in a way that, at least for me, music doesn't do that, paintings don't do that. It's a particular, unique, I think, privilege that fiction offers. And by doing so, you actually you get access to the truth, as it were, in a way that I think sometimes other forms of writing doesn't. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Saleh. I'm a student at the University of Nairobi. So I have a set of questions, but they're sort of interconnected. So I hope.
But make it quick.
Okay. So one of the main thematic concerns in the book was bullying. And the character, James Calhoun, he was like the nemesis of the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think the actions that he did, was it sort of, was he a benefactor of the white privilege that you mentioned earlier?
Mm-hmm.
And does it present a broader problem with the school system? Because you could see the interaction between Mr. Ilmi and the principal. And then also connecting to that, was it wise for Noor to behave and portray himself in the way he did in the book, because he sort of painted himself as a big target for the bully to torment him? And then, this is more of a personal opinion. At the end of the book, the mother and the brother of the main protagonist.
Don't give up the
No, I won't spoil, I promise, I won't spoil. So they embarked on that mission, and the story ended.
Yeah.
So when you were writing that, did you think they succeeded or they didn't succeed after that?
So I'm working on my third novel, which has nothing to do with the story, but I actually would love to write a sequel to what happens after that mission. The mission, we'll call it the mission, and just leave it there. But to answer your first question, which is a great question about bullying and whether or not Noor had a part in sort of almost like attracting that kind of bullying by the way he sort of presents himself to the school, to society. There is a current debate that's going on in Canada, especially in a province called Quebec, which just passed a law that basically tells Muslim women that, if you want to work in government offices, if you want to basically be a part of the society, you have to remove your full hijab. And I think it's a really complicated and interesting question about how do you practice your beliefs, how do you show your outward how do you basically construct your identity as a Muslim, as a Jew, as anything really, in a society where you've been told you have that freedom. And at infinitum, we're told in the West, again, I'll say the West, that you have this freedom to be who you are and to show the world who you are. And then more and more we're finding that actually some people they have basically there's a cutoff line as to what they're comfortable with. And I think Norris is dealing with, in some ways, he's not even conscious of that conversation. His whole thinking is, this is who I am, this is how I present myself to the world. And if innocently, I think naively, he doesn't really consider what the ramifications of that is in terms of attracting special attention from people that's negative, and bullying being one of them. And in terms of privilege, again, another great question, and something that I actually wasn't even thinking about consciously, but several reviewers have pointed this out, several readers have pointed it out, is that how this privilege is enjoyed by James Calhoun, his nemesis, and how that is not enjoyed by Noor. And I think a lot of that has to do with, again, that net of privilege that we're talking about that catches you when you get into trouble. And that's something that a lot of times, unfortunately, people of colors, immigrants that have that privilege of being able to act out, to basically lash out and then enjoy this second, 3, 4 chances.
We'll take 3 more questions so that we can get to the book signing.
Yeah.
Was it that person?
Yeah.
Okay, you?
Can you hear me? Oh, it's on. Okay. My name is Mudaki. I am from Nairobi, and I am going to pivot a little bit of Nanjala's question about truth. And because you just brought to mind sort of this weight that I feel literature, I'm not going to say from Africa, but from our region often carries. So my question then is, do you think entertainment can be a valid, pure endpoint for literature that I will say Africans write? Do you think it's possible for books that we write to only have this goal in mind, or do you think it's inherent that weight will be added to the kind of books we write, whether that's just a romance novel that you've written, a crime thriller that you've written? Do you think that it's inherent that weight then will be added onto that? And there was a really bad part to this question that was really clever, but I can't remember what it is.
I think the first part of your question is so weighty, so complicated. Let's stick with that one.
But I can't remember what it is, but it's something that I think it's interesting for us to reflect on, because I think, do you think it's, first of all, valid? Do you think it's possible to do this, to just write for entertainment's sake? Yes, privilege. Do you think writing for entertainment is a privilege that we can have?
That's a pretty weird question. Oh, please, Abdi, please help me out here. Yeah. This is a question that, so I majored in English, and I remember having these kinds of discussions often, especially when I took these courses that were specifically for, African American literature or Caribbean literature or, post-independent African literature. It was always the questions that were asked were when it came to literature produced by Africans or blacks or women. And there is a kind of expectation that's placed on these writers to sort of speak for more than the characters, to speak for more than themselves, to speak for a people, a nation. And it's not something that I've ever concerned myself with, even though I would like to think that, I write serious fiction, I don't write thrillers, I don't write, God forbid, romance novels. So in a sense, yes, I would like the work to be taken seriously. In a sense, yes, I would like to instigate some kind of conversation and serious debates. But again, I would like to also be afforded the privilege and the right of not speaking for anyone else. And I realize I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. I get it. But that's just how I feel. I don't want to speak for an entire continent or entire race or an entire anything for that matter.
I think in response to that, probably this idea of should our work and should we write for our own entertainment? Because I think all of you being here tonight is privilege, right? And the idea that also that books are not read in this country or this continent, books are not sold in this country. I mean, there are a bunch of books in there. You can all go and buy them.
For tonight, there are books.
Yes, a lot of writers are in this room, Nanjala included, who just launched her book. And you can buy her book, and that sort of it creates a wave, right? Why are we waiting for this big wave of Hassan's book is going to be at the New York Times bestseller? We don't have to wait for that. We can get it there by buying all the books that are here tonight and making our own story and making our own valid ecosystem.
But just to talk about that privilege of having an audience, it's not something that I take for granted. Every single reader who's ever come up to me and said, I read your novel and it made me think of this, or it made me question something, that is a privilege and I'm sure you feel this way with your own writing, even though it might be different in nature, is somebody coming up to you and saying that last article you published, they don't have to like it. I mean, I don't want compliments. I don't want people to say, that was fantastic. I would rather they said, I found that interesting and I needed to read it. To me, that's actually more interesting. And so the fact that we have all these wonderful people who've decided to be here with us tonight is a privilege that we never take for granted as storytellers, as writers. So thank you.
Okay, so one, and then two, and then we're done. Maybe we'll add you up. Go. You. Yep.
Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Hassan. Congratulations on your book and publication. I guess my question is, what role do you think literature like this has in a Somali household? Do you think that readership within people who are middle-aged and above, especially in the diaspora, are accessing literature like this, consuming it, trying to understand the world in which they live in, trying to understand the world that their children live in? Do you think that literature like this can have an impact in a Somali household, and if so, how?
I know. They're taking cue from you, Abdi. That's a really great question. And last year I had the privilege of attending this Mogadishu book fair, and I've met so many amazing young people who are so hungry for books. And one of the unfortunate byproducts of the war has been the destruction of libraries in Somalia. So you have an entire generation of young people who've never had books in their homes, who've never had the privilege of going to a library and signing up a book, and getting that access and that being transported to another world, another time, another person's mind and thinking. So that's something that I think is incredibly, is hugely missing from Somali households, from Somali cities, from Somali neighborhoods, that access to books. And it doesn't have to be fiction, it could be books about, it could be a science book, it could be a book about, cosmology, geology, whatever it is, that ability to be able to sort of have this thing, this artifact in your hands, and giving you that privilege of reading, I think is something that I would love to see more of, and would love to, in any way that I can, support. And I've just been invited to again attend the Mogadishu Book Fair, which I'm really looking forward to, and will personally donate some, not just my book, but also a bunch of books from my own bookshelf, because there's an organization that actually is trying to build a space where people can come and take out books and read the books, and I can actually tweet the organization's name, and anything that you can do to support that effort, I think would be incredibly transformative for the young people of Somalia who don't have that privilege of just going to a library and checking out a book.
You and you. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Mohammed Bakari, and I'm the Vice Chancellor of RAF International University, and also Professor of Linguistics and Postcolonial Literature. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to be reprimanded now.
This is not hubris. It's just that I felt very bad when Hassan felt extremely apologetic about writing in English and not writing in Somali, and talking about this rather romantic view of the Somali language. As a linguist, you can take it from me that there is no superior language and an inferior language, a beautiful language and an ugly language. All languages actually are at the same par. But we tend, especially when we are in the diaspora, to think that our languages, there's something inadequate about me because I don't know Kiswahili well enough, and that I write in English. So I can assure you, I really enjoyed reading your book. And just a week back or two, I was reading Nuruddin Farah's North of Dawn. And I think the two books actually have to be read together. Because here...
I don't know how Nuruddin can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because here you have the voices of two different generations. I've been a fan of Nuruddin Farah for years, from the time he wrote from the Crooked Dream, to the latest one. I've read both his fiction and also his non-fiction, like Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. The kinds of issues that you have been addressing yourself to. This kind of genre, which you, or rather the themes, these have been actually before, like Hanif Quresh's My Son the Fanatic. You know, if you read that, then some of these characters, like the Imam, you know, he must have developed from that level. So I just wanted to assure you that there's absolutely nothing wrong in writing in English. And I really loved your sense of humor, because you write about serious issues, and within in there, you know, you pass on these issues. And the issue of language is an issue again that Teju Cole, you know, raises, because the idea that, oh, you know, you can only write in English. You know, this is the most beautiful language, because that's probably the only language that you know. So there are a lot of really nice literary pieces in virtually all languages. So he said, you know, he has really enjoyed Yoruba, epic poetry, and so on and so forth. So let's not romanticize, you know, these cultures, these languages, and so on and so forth. And Nuruddin Farah is particularly hard on these kinds of things. He's not at all romantic about Somali culture, you know, Somali attitudes, you know, especially in their relationship to other people. So I think we should read both North of Dawn and The Youth of God. Wonderful novels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very cool. Thank you.
And we'll take the last question comment.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Makambito. At the moment I'm studying international politics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, which is actually the capital of, I think, fanatical people in the third world. So my question is basically, I'd like to ask the writer. Wherever we have people in the diaspora writing about the African actually cause, we always write about being wronged. But I believe also, like in most cases, there's a lot of us people in the diaspora who are actually virtually misusing the privileges that they're given there and the opportunities that they get actually in the diaspora. A case study is when we have a case of people pretending that they're escaping the FDF, people pretending that they're escaping civil war, even members of parliament who are still now families living outside and actually getting benefits under the refugee status in other countries. And why is it that in most cases we don't actually give the story, whereas we are wronging our visitors, let's say our hosts, in a way that it opens up even our mistakes? In most cases, the stories are us being wronged, and we don't talk about us wronging our host. Why is it that most of the stories I read about written by us in the diaspora is always like us being the people who are being wronged? Thank you.
Actually, a really good question, and I think this is something we talked about earlier about the idea of. So there is, as we talked about earlier, there is a character, an imam in the novel who I think would fall into that category of somebody who's wronging this system, this country, this host society, if you want to call it, that has welcomed him, that he's a part of. And in a sense, now that I think about it, it was my way of actually showing that being wronged and being, I hate this word, but being victimized or being marginalized goes both ways, and that I think something that, I think there's a scene, if I remember correctly, and I should remember since I wrote the damn thing, there is a scene in which the imam says something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing now, that it basically disgusts him to live in this country. Yeah, and it's something that I would honestly say, yes, I've come across in Toronto, in other places, people who have this incredibly visceral feeling about the place that they live, that, you know, whose passports they carry, whose society they live among, and then they have this visceral hatred for it. And in having this character in the novel, it was my way of actually bringing that issue, again, another word I hate, issue, but that idea into the mix, is that this goes both ways. Not just that immigrant communities are marginalized and put upon and poor them. It also works the other way around. So I'm glad that you actually brought that point up, and I think it's something that is important that we continue to talk about that, because I think if we're ever going to have a genuine and honest conversation, we have to talk about all of those things, and not just from our perspective as refugee communities or people who live in countries that they weren't born into.
Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. I really am happy about the turnout and the way the discussion has gone tonight. Hassan will now be in that room to sign copies of the book, and you can buy copies of the book. And the powers vested in me, I now declare the global tour of the Youth of Thought officially open.